What you seem to be saying is that Stone Age people were eating, cooking, and living on top of this midden, on top of these oyster shells, and each layer represents a different generation.
Yes, that's true. We also know now from this year's excavation that the midden actually is used for temporary dwellings up to the very early Iron Age, around 400 BC. And the reason we know that before we have the radiocarbon dates ready for this excavation season is that we found a skeleton of a child, a 4-5-year-old child, with grave goods that indicates very early Iron Age. The child had a bronze ring in the left ear, and around the neck a glass bead, a very small glass bead that we can date to the centuries just before BC. And that was dug down into a part of the midden, covered again with some hearts and a part of the midden, meaning that after that time, for some years, the midden was still in use.
Oysters from that midden on Ballysadare Bay were clearly an important item of food for the people of Carramore, who, according to Dr. Burenholt, were not settled agriculturally, but hunters and gatherers who had a seasonal circuit of moving around this lush peninsula. Oysters and mussels were found in a pit alongside one of the stone circles in the cemetery. These were unopened shells, suggesting perhaps that they were an offering to sustain the spirits of the dead on a journey into the world beyond. In the centre of that circle of stones, or dolmen as they're called, there's a chamber made up of 5 tall slabs with an enormous capping stone on top, giving the whole thing an appearance of an open-ended box. Since the site was filled in after the excavation, the local farmers' cattle use it for shelter. We had to persuade them to leave, so that Dr. Burenholt could lead me inside to see where he uncovered some very early cremations.
We were fortunate enough in this chamber to get in the 4 corners, which you can see here, 4 intact cremations placed under a very fine dry walling of stone slabs to fill out the space between the bottom part of the orthostats here. 4 intact cremations of young girls that the archaeologists could show us to be between 18 and 22 years of age. And a strange thing was that together with each of these 4 cremations, he found a bone or 2 belonging to another individual, probably a man, because it was a very big, a much larger piece than should have been there.
Could that have been a coincidence? Could that have been placed there sometime later?
No, it couldn't. The intact position shows us that after the dry walling was put above the cremation, nothing could be added to that. And that means that, of course, the thought did arise that it could be sacrifices, together with the erection of the monuments, the sacrifice of 4 young girls, and the bones of some important man cremated and buried, perhaps the first one to be buried in this monument. We have in other monuments found the same feature.
Other monuments on the same site, here at Carramore?
Yes, at Carramore, where we have undisturbed cysts with the bones, with a young girl and an older man.
The Swedish team usually excavates with a bone specialist and an environmentalist on site, and as the organic finds come out of the excavation, the archaeologists can get an immediate scientific assessment. And this close involvement of scientific specialists has enabled them, for instance, to produce an artist's impression of what one of those cremated Carramore girls might have looked like.
Although the skeletons were burnt very thoroughly, we have been very lucky. The archaeologists have been able to establish the death age and the sex of more than 60% of the material, which is very good in a cremated material. And normally you don't get these high values. And then we have also been lucky in finding, for this particular woman or young girl of the age of 20 around, pieces that are very characteristic. The bones from the face and the head that are so characteristic. So he dared to make this reconstruction, pieces from the jaw and pieces from the forehead just above one of the eyes.
These must have been very large pieces to have survived.
No, they are not large pieces, but they are so characteristic in their shape. So the original shape of the whole face can, with some certainty, be reconstructed. And I think it's important that you do that to get out to a larger public, that we have an idea of how these people did look like.
It's a very modern-looking face, though, isn't it?
We know, of course, that it's exactly the same race that you and I belong to, and the size of the brain was exactly the same as today. So actually you wouldn't find much difference if you met a Stone Age girl here today.
The dates of the burials, the great midden of oyster shells, and the arrowheads and scrapers found at the hut site on the mountainside all seem to fit the picture of the Carrowmore way of life which Dr. Burenholt has proposed. But if these people, the builders of the megaliths, were not the result of a migratory wave sometime after 3000 BC from Western Europe, where did they come from?
Well, they belong to the Mesolithic population that has been here for a very long time. The earliest date we have from a settlement at Carrowmore is 7400 BC. And that's a clearly Mesolithic settlement we have down at Wood Park by the coastline of Bellesadair Bay. And that means that people were living in this resource area, in this territory we are standing on, long before the first monument. And you had these Mesolithic populations all over the island. They might have come in from England and the continent before the creation of the Irish Sea and the channels. So they could easily have walked here. But they were here thousands of years before the people started to build megaliths. And then you get an increased populations. You get a change in economy gradually. And of course you get influences from the outside at some stage, but not until around 4500 BC the community here is ready to build megaliths. And I think, well, we know today that you have to have quite a number of people to build megaliths. It's nothing you do if you are only 2 or 3 families. And the reason that Carrowmore is a cemetery with clustered tombs and not single spread out monuments is most certainly that this was the only steady point they had in their seasonal circuit system. They went down here to bury their dead, to get married, to have their feasts and ceremonials and whatever. And then they split up again in smaller groups. This is the tribe center. Probably each of the tombs here represent a smaller group within this tribe of, say, 4 or 5 families. And perhaps 10 of these together form the tribe at the peninsula here, say 200-300 people or something like that at the same time, not many more.
The Swedish evidence has not convinced all archaeologists in Ireland. Some feel that more sites need to be explored, that new evidence and more dates may come from excavation of a larger number of standing monuments at Carrowmore. But it's a view not shared by Professor Michael O'Kelly, who has monitored the results of the Swedish work carefully. Did it come as a surprise to him that the Carrowmore people appeared not to be a settled farming community, and yet were able to organize themselves to build these large megaliths, while at the same time leading a semi-nomadic sort of way of life?
We have always tended to underestimate the abilities of our early ancestors. Archaeologists everywhere tend to underestimate what people can do.
I suppose one of the most surprising results, and perhaps the linchpin for the chronology of so much of the megalithic culture in Ireland and in Western Europe, must be those radiocarbon dates showing that the first monument in Carrowmore in the west of Ireland was built as far back as 4600 BC. This has turned the whole idea of how megalithic culture spread across Ireland upside down, hasn't it?
Indeed, yes, because it has always been argued that the passage grave cult began in the Boyne Valley, and that the people who first arrived here gradually moved westward across the country, ending up in Carrowmore in this series of small monuments, if you compare them with the Boyne Valley sites. So that we now have to rethink the whole passage grave cult in Ireland, the earliest tombs being at Carrowmore and the Boyne Valley tombs being at the end of the line. A complete reversal.
1,000 years later, in fact,
1,000
in the Boyne
years
Valley.
later, yes. And again, quite clearly, the position here is that sites like Newgrange could only have been built by settled agricultural people. And our findings here have shown that this, in fact, was the case. Presumably, the cult idea, the building of houses for the dead, the spirits of the dead. Presumably this idea became promulgated widely. If you look at a distribution map of megalithic tombs for Europe, you will see that they cover a very, very wide area indeed, from the Mediterranean right through to Scandinavia. It was the idea which travelled as a result of small contacts between groups of people. As the idea came into each territory, the local people made their own of it and produced their own version of the house for the dead. So that one shouldn't really think of a movement of people either from Carrowmore eastward to the Boyne Valley, or the reverse as has been the thought in the past. One has to see the idea moving from person to person or whatever, and then each area producing its own version of the built monument.
To what extent will these studies in Carrowmore affect one's thinking about the megalithic culture throughout Western Europe? Are they important in the wider European context?
You see, in Ireland, the pressure of life has been considerably less than it has been over Europe and Britain. The result is that very much more undisturbed ground is available for study, and the situation at Carrowmore is ideal. Now, further work at Carrowmore will surely fill in many of the gaps in the general picture which Dr. Bodenholt has achieved so far. And I think that we can quite legitimately apply this information to the megalithic areas of Britain and Europe.
Next summer, Dr. Joran Bodenholt and his team return to Sligo for a final season. They'll be searching for and investigating more settlement sites in the hope of finding out more about the living people who built the houses for the dead at Carrowmore.